Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The first week of 2016 has laid bare the new reality of the way politics is being prosecuted by the government and the opposition. Collective cabinet responsibility has been all but suspended. Neither David Cameron nor Jeremy Corbyn is in total control of their senior ministers, a far cry from the heyday of Margaret Thatcher or Tony Blair. In the cabinet and in the shadow cabinet, there are divisions on the major issues facing this country that are deeper than the San Andreas fault. But is this a weakness or a strength? Walter Bagehot described the British cabinet as the buckle that fastens the legislative part of the state to the executive part. And starting in the 18th century, when Sir Robert Walpole's first modern cabinet adopted a united position to counter the power of the monarch, and continuing through the 19th century as the growth of the state demanded a coherent unified government, the British cabinet has adopted the convention of collective responsibility. However much they disagree in private, cabinet ministers are bound to support a united position in public. Any minister who cannot support the agreed policy has the option to resign, and some have done so. The convention held for the most part throughout the last century, though Liberal members of the national government were allowed to vote against tariff reform in 1932. And in 1975, facing a huge cabinet split, Harold Wilson allowed his ministers to campaign on both sides of the European referendum. But collective responsibility held strong throughout the 1980s, when Chancellor Nigel Lawson strongly disagreed with the poll tax in cabinet, but held his tongue publicly, and on into the new century, when high-profile ministers resigned in protest at the Iraq War.
I intend to join those tomorrow night who vote against military action now. It is for that reason, and that reason alone, and with a heavy heart, that I've resigned from the government.
But public unity hid private dysfunction. And when a new coalition government took power, there was no longer even any sense in pretending that the government was united.
We are announcing a new politics.
Even though he no longer needs the Lib Dems to govern, he still has a problem getting his cabinet to back him on EU membership. Like Wilson's cabinet, they will now be allowed to campaign on both sides in this year's referendum.
I say the threat is now,
and Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn is also having trouble enforcing collective responsibility. Despite his shadow foreign secretary opposing him in the Syria debate, he stayed in post in this week's reshuffle. With cabinet unity faltering on all sides, is the convention of collective responsibility a thing of the past? Well, joining me to chew over this constitutional conundrum is Sally Morgan, formerly a top advisor in Tony Blair's Downing Street, Polly Mackenzie, who is a policy advisor to Nick Clegg, and Catherine Haddon, resident historian at the Institute for Government. Good evening to everybody. Sally Morgan, first of all, it's been an extraordinary week, hasn't it?
Bizarre. I mean, bizarre. You couldn't make it up, really, could you?
Well, you've got we'll deal with the cabinet in a minute, but you've got a shadow cabinet where Jeremy Corbyn doesn't have authority.
No, I mean, he doesn't have authority over the PLP, over the Parliamentary Labour Party, though, and you know, which is the really significant issue, I think. And the shadow cabinet are a sort of small section of that. That's what we're seeing.
But not only that, he has the possibility of further revolt. We know that, of course, he's talked about Hilary Benn having to revolt from the backbenches, but there'll be we know there's many divisions in that shadow cabinet.
Of course. I mean, he doesn't, look, he's in an extremely weak position. My guess is that he will gradually produce a cabinet more in his own liking, but in the end...
He started to do that to a certain extent.
He started to do that, but he's really much more interested in the party and the country than he is in the party and Parliament.
Catherine Haddon, I mean, how important do you think is collective cabinet responsibility for government to work for the good of the country?
It is very important. I mean, it's one of our core constitutional tenets. It's the way in which a parliamentary party works and maintains its cohesiveness in its relationship to Parliament and in showing that sort of strength and of purpose, basically.
But even though we know that in the past, and as a historian you know, it has been a pretence.
Yes, it has, and not just at those big moments, 1932 and 1975, when they had these agreements to differ, and indeed under the coalition government, but also you see it in different ways. I mean, one of the tenets of it is that they won't talk about cabinet meetings, and yet ministers leak all the time.
Yes.
So there are ways in which ministers find to dissent from government policy that go outside of the formal practices.
Well, funny enough, talking about leaking all the time, Polly, when it came to the coalition, there wasn't actually enough leaking for to keep kind of Nick Clegg in the public's good books, or I should say the Liberal Democrat voters' good books, because actually he turned over on so many things.
Well, I think the period of coalition government demonstrated that people can disagree in government, they can disagree publicly and sort of semi-privately in the way Catherine's talking about, and the world doesn't end. You know, maybe if there'd been more briefing and more candour about those disagreements, then the Liberal Democrats wouldn't have suffered so much. I don't know, but
they did suffer, and that's what I was saying. He did roll over on tuition fees, which was a key tenet. It was totemic, and I wonder if there'd actually been much more discussion about that outside cabinet. If there had actually been dissent, the Liberal Democrats would not have come such a cropper.
I think certainly when explaining the tuition fees debate, at the beginning it was very much sticking to the line of collective responsibility, this is the best policy. And it was only over the course of several years that Nick started to talk about it having been a compromise, having been a deal, something he didn't really want to do. And I think people bought that more, though I think for the voters it was really too late.
What did it look like from your position, what was happening in the coalition?
In a way it made sense, because you've got two parties in government, and we see this in New Zealand.
And being true to their manifestos?
Yes, and you know, they brought them together, but at the same time, collective cabinet responsibility is partly about party management, and in which case you're managing two different parties, and that's what happened in 1932. They didn't want the Liberals to leave the party, and they knew the only way to do so was to give them that leeway to be able to talk about their policies separately from the other members.
We were talking about 1975, but there was only a month between the negotiations for Europe finished and there was a referendum. David Cameron faces this yawning period where he's going to have some pretty big beasts in his own cabinet actively campaigning against him. Will that ultimately damage him, or damage that whole idea of collective cabinet responsibility for the Conservatives?
Well, it's a tricky thing to manage, but I mean, actually, if you talk about 75, the problems they had were through 74. Tony Benn pushing against the limits of collective cabinet responsibility, and Harold Wilson having to manage that through that period.
But let's remember in 2011 there was a referendum where cabinet ministers were arguing against each other on platforms on the alternative vote.
AV.
And yes, it was two parties, but the truth is the world didn't come to an end. Government carried on making thousands of decisions every day on every single topic. And yes, some of the time ministers were campaigning.
Isn't it also, though, really whether or not it looks like David Cameron's in charge? And I mean, is the Prime Minister who said that this wasn't going to happen and then has changed his mind patently, obviously, because he can't actually deliver the Cabinet, because several members have already said that they're not standing for it.
But there's precedent because of exactly what we're talking about with Harold Wilson, though.
But that was weakness as well. I mean, in the end,
so you think it's weakness?
I think it's weakness. I don't think it's new politics at all. I think it's weakness.
Well, let's go back to your time with Tony Blair, because of course there was collective cabinet responsibility then, but we know now, we knew then, we know that it was an absolute disaster inside and actually incredibly corrosive, and the public knew that. Wouldn't it have been better actually if you'd actually aired differences, if there actually not had been what essentially was a real diminution actually of cabinet?
I mean, people say that. I mean, I don't think that's accurate, because actually there were big arguments within cabinet, and that's the right place. If you're running a government and you've got collective responsibility, you want to have big rows. I remember big rows in cabinet meetings on areas of public service reform. I mean, big rows.
Well, give me an example of where somebody backed down. There was really fighting.
There was significant fighting on a range of health reforms and school reforms, on the academy programme, for example. But the rows did take place in Cabinet, and in a sense, you're right, of course there was disagreement at that point, and Gordon had a level of disagreement, but Cabinet took a decision. Cabinet backed the policy very clearly, and you know, you do need to have those arguments in Cabinet. I think that worked in coalition.
But what did the public make of all this? But I wonder what the public makes of all this. And we live in an age, of course, where, as you say, there are leaks from Cabinet. There's much more pressure now. There's obviously different news outlets. People tweet, social media.
You know, the voters want honesty, don't they?
I agree. I think the public know when a politician is just spinning them a line and saying something that they don't believe. And in the long term within a party, it festers this sense that you are only sticking to the party line because you're being bullied by the boss. And if Cameron wants to be able to say that the referendum, when it comes, was a fair fight, then he has to give the rebels, as we assume they will be, the opportunity to campaign on their own terms.
But where does that put the idea of a Corbyn shadow cabinet at the moment? Because what he said, you know, it's about the voters. Diane Abbott was saying on Newsnight, you know, everybody assesses it. You know, it's about the party people. It's about the party. But actually, it's not just about the party. It is about the PLP, and it's about members of the shadow cabinet.
Well, I mean, I find the situation the Labour Party is in deeply alarming. But it seems to me that it's part of a project, and it's a long-term incremental project that Sally was talking about, to slowly build up a shadow cabinet that is cohesive and coherent.
Because would his cabinet, would that form of shadow cabinet work in government?
What, the one he's got now? No, it'd be chaos. It'd be chaos. And I think the difficulty of saying the public understand, I think in the end the public do kind of want to know what the government is that they're electing. And I think one of the reasons it actually sort of did work in coalition is I think you clearly had good arguments, but then you did reach decisions and you stuck to them, and then you did go out and you largely argued for it.
Because I mean, what you know, Corbyn and McDonnell have said to Hilary Benn is, yes, you can rebel all you're right, but you rebel from the back benches. So there isn't a kind of new politics in Labour.
There's no new politics in Labour. It's very old politics in Labour. Very old politics at the moment in Labour.
How will this look at this period, do you think, in history?
It's difficult to know at this juncture. I mean, obviously, these issues are going to be massive for the parties themselves. They're going to set the course for them. And again, that goes back to these past examples that we've got. The reason why collective responsibility was so important wasn't just about governing the country. It was about whether or not the parties would split, whether they would reform in different ways in the way they did in the late 19th century. And a lot of this is actually just about party management rather than the sort of strict constitutional issue of collective responsibility.
Thank you all very much indeed.